Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Canadians with Disabilities and Their Allies. My name is Brent. I'm the host. And today we have Lori Thomas joining us for a episode about affordable housing and subsidized housing and rents that are inadequate to meet the standard means of, having affordable housing. Hi, Lori.
Hi.
Hi. And welcome to the show. And it's a great pleasure having someone with lived experience on PWD since 2004.
Yes.
Yeah. So Lori, could you tell us your story, about lived experience, what you've gone through in your life? I mean, on a day-to-day basis, all the struggles that one has to endure with the rates that are almost 50% below the poverty level.
All right. Well, I guess my journey really started when I was 19. My parents, I was the last one in the house, and I needed to either get a job, move out, or go on to income assistance. And at that time, I was only awarded $175 a month, of which $75 was given to my parents for room and board. I had to go through job clubs, and I didn't actually learn about disability until there was actually a disability program until I was in the psychiatric ward in 2004, early 2004. So it took me about 6 months, maybe a little bit more, maybe 7 or 8 months to actually go through the process to get onto disability. Still at that time, I was paying $525 for rent, and I didn't have a lot of money, actually. I was, again, on income assistance trying to get onto disability. It was definitely difficult, and eventually when I did get onto disability, I was sitting at just under $800 a month to live off of. Now, presently, that's doubled. But my living costs haven't doubled. They've actually tripled or quadrupled in size. The cost of living is significantly higher than it was in 2004. And here am I still surviving. I'm not thriving. I've been lucky enough to have a couple of opportunities to be in affordable housing. One time I was actually in a shelter because I could not get a space to rent with market rent. My journey has been all over the board. I would just really like to see some consistency in the financial support for people with disabilities. I believe that having a basic income would provide people with the support that they require to have a purposeful life and be a part of a community rather than just a file number or a number for BC Housing that they are putting people into their BC Housing projects. That's pretty much general story of my life. I just want a better life, not just for myself, but for my fellow people that are living with disabilities as well.
Yeah, it's definitely quite the journey that you've endured, with rates that are subpar for sure, right? I mean, 40 to 50% below the poverty level, and each province is definitely different in their rates. But BC is the most expensive province in Canada with the highest taxes for sure, and rates need to be incomparable to meet that cost of living.
I do have a little part-time job, and that does help me, but as a person with a disability, I can only work a certain amount of time, so I can't have a full-time job because I won't be able to sustain it. And they've put financial restrictions on people with disabilities for earning over a certain amount. So I just find it, whatever they're doing, it's restrictive. I think too is that the support portion of PWD has increased quite a bit in the last little while, but the trigger here is that the shelter portion remains $375, and rent actually has not been $375 since 1988. Like 1988 was the average rent was around $375 or $385 a month. They're not being realistic within the shelter portion. If they could increase the shelter portion to be more realistic within the inflation and cost of living, then I would see that it could be a possibility for people to survive, but it just isn't. Having a rent portion for $375 when your rent is anywhere from $906 or $1,358 is not responsible. It's not a good way to promote inclusion for a group of people that have really struggled in not just financially, but just in different ways within society to be a part of society. I know with history, it's been, people with disabilities have been the white elephant in the room, and we haven't gotten the support that we require, not just financially, but, in supportive services and all sorts of different areas that are required for us to actually be productive and be healthy participants in society. So, yeah.
Yeah, those rates, the 375 shelter allowance rates have been frozen since April 1st, 2007. And I've been advocating really strong for many years on that through successive governments who deliberately ignored the fact that nobody can find a place to rent at $375. Like you said, back in 1980s, yes, you could find a place. I know because my mom rented a house, and the house was $425, right? And I wasn't on on disability at that time, but my mom was low income. She struggled, but we were able to have a whole house for $425. So back then, I think when I did my research, it goes back as far as 1989 when the shelter allowance was $275, and in 1992, I think it was $225. In 1992, it went to $275, and then in April 1st, 2007, it jumped up to $375, so $50 increase, and it's remained at that way for 15 years and 3 months.
Yeah.
And market rents are like anywhere, like you're looking at $1,600 minimum.
Yeah. And that's too much for a single person on disability to live there. They can't live there.
Exactly.
They can't afford the rent. And if they can't afford the rent, how are they supposed to eat? How are they supposed to pay their bills? Like, we all have bills. We all have to pay for internet and for our phone. And what if there's heat? You need to heat the place in the winter. All these things are added expenses. And the bill goes even higher and higher to the place where it's not doable on your own. So you're either living with someone that you don't know, or you're living with, you can live with someone that you do know that's healthy, that is an option. But most of the time what people do is that they just get all together and they figure it out, and they don't have the best relationships with the people that they're living with because they're strangers. And that can be a difficulty in and of itself when you're dealing with people with diverse disabilities as well. Like if you have a house full of people that have mental health issues, that might trigger people to do some unhealthy behaviors as well. So it definitely isn't good. And the fact that they are claiming that they're building all of these new housing and all of that, it really it actually comes out to that they've built less than 300 additional housing for people that are for affordable rent, like supportive housing. But they claim that anything that's supportive is supplement. So for people that are on safer, like our seniors, people that are families that are getting that financial support every month, homeless shelters, all of these get combined together, and as well as any hotel that has been bought as an SRO, they claim that as supportive housing when really it already existed. It was a hotel. It just has been turned into supportive housing. So there's a fine line with BC Housing, what they're claiming and what the nitty-gritty details, what they're actually doing. It comes out to be very minimal. So people that are in supportive housing like me right now, I have to stay here so that I can possibly go and move to another housing because I can't afford market rent. But there's also people doing that. The process of doing that is incredibly difficult as well. All of these things, all of these supports that people with disabilities are required to go through can actually thwart people from actually seeking the support to begin with. Because getting onto disability or seeking housing, it can be too difficult for them to do it on their own. I almost gave up when I tried to get onto disability because it seemed like I was jumping through hundreds of hoops to get something that I needed. The process needs to be easier and more just easier for people to access the housing and support that they need to have a healthy life. There's got to be a way to do that.
Yeah, there's definitely a long waiting list too to get into supportive housing. I mean, you're looking over 10-year waiting list, at least. And then, of course, it's prioritized, right? It's prioritized based on needs. And I inquired one time, I phoned them up, and they were talking about rent banks. And how I stumbled across it was they said, oh, well, the person says, well, I actually work for BC Housing. I'm like, oh. So I said, well, I mean, how would a person want to get into BC Housing? Well, are you in housing? I mean, I go, no, I pay market rent. Oh, okay. Well, you can't just get into BC Housing if you're paying market rent. You basically have to be homeless. I'm like, you have to be homeless in order to get into it? That's correct. And they're like, they said, don't shoot the messenger. I mean, in other words. And I'm like, that's messed up. They said, well, if it comes down to maybe your living situation is that if your house has been sold or condemned or you're fleeing violence, so like, and if it's a health issue, they will look at that, but it's not part of the criteria if you are in housing still, just because you want to pay cheaper rent. So I agree that yes, things have to change because, Lori, there's a lot of red tape that is involved in all this process. And also, a lot of people don't realize too that PWD, regardless if they're in, like, say, subsidized housing or they're in paying market rent, they're still persons with disabilities, and they still deserve to have the same standard of living. So when PWD are in market housing, they pay high market rent, but they're in subsidized housing, they get to pay a little bit cheaper rent, but it doesn't mean that subsidized housing is always a better solution either, because the kind of conditions that housing can be is maybe not, as you mentioned too, it's not always the best.